A racist judge slaps a black man in his courtroom, believing him to be just another defendant beneath his power. But what he doesn't know? That man is a billionaire, one who now holds the judge's entire future in his hands. Within hours, the judge's world is flipped upside down. His name is disgraced, his reputation destroyed. And the man he humiliated isn't out for revenge, he's out for something far more powerful. How do you break a man who never thought he could fall? And what happens when the only person who can save him is the one he once tried to crush? Stay with us for this unforgettable story of downfall, reckoning, and redemption. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 237, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. William Tate stood at the back, his fingers wrapped tightly around the smooth railing that separated the gallery from the proceedings, his father's courtroom. For 30 years, Judge Marcus Tate had presided here, dispensing what William had once believed was justice. The familiar smell of lemon polish and aged wood filled his nostrils, but today, it felt different. Suffocating. The once comforting scent now seemed to mock the memories of watching his father command this room with authority and respect. William's expensive suit fell too tight around his neck as he watched the current proceedings. Judge Reynolds, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, now occupied his father's former seat, the same chair where Marcus Tate had ruled on thousands of cases, where he'd shaped lives with the bang of his gavel, where he'd betrayed everything the law stood for. A young clerk hurried past, papers clutched to her chest, her shoes clicking against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room, drawing a few irritated glances from the attorneys presenting their arguments. William barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the judge's bench, remembering. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber, startling William from his thoughts. The assembled crowd stood as Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess. As people began filing out, William remained rooted to his spot, his knuckles white against the railing. "Mr. Tate?" A familiar voice made him turn. Barbara Chen, his father's former clerk, stood beside him. Her kind face showed the weight of recent events. "I didn't expect to see you here." William's jaw tightened. "Neither did I." Barbara glanced around before lowering her voice. "Have you spoken to him?" "No." The word came out harder than he intended. William forced himself to soften his tone. "And I don't plan to." "He's not doing well, William. The investigation, the media circus, it's taking its toll." A bitter laugh escaped William's lips. "Good. Let him feel something for once." Barbara's eyes widened slightly at his harshness. "He's still your father. A father who took bribes to let criminals walk free." William's voice trembled with barely contained anger. "A father who made a mockery of everything I believe in, everything I've dedicated my life to as an attorney." The nearly empty courtroom seemed to absorb his words, the heavy silence that followed pressing down on them both. Through the windows, clouds had begun to gather, dimming the morning light. "You know," Barbara said quietly, "I remember watching you here as a boy. You'd sit in that back row doing your homework while waiting for your father to finish his docket." William's throat tightened. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, some other family untainted by scandal and shame. "I used to be proud," he whispered, more to himself than to Barbara. "Proud to be Judge Tate's son, proud to follow in his footsteps." He shook his head. "Now every time I stand before a judge, I wonder if they're looking at me and seeing him, wondering if I'm cut from the same corrupt cloth." Barbara reached out as if to touch his arm, but seemed to think better of it. "Your reputation stands on its own, William. Everyone knows you're one of the most ethical attorneys in the city." "Do they?" He turned to face her fully. "Because every time I walk into a courtroom now, I can feel the whispers. There goes Tate's boy. 20 years building my career, and he destroyed my name in a single day." The bailiff re-entered the courtroom, preparing for the session to resume. Barbara gave William a last, sad look. "Your father made terrible mistakes," she said softly. "But don't let his actions poison everything you remember about him. That man who sat up there for 30 years, he wasn't always what he became at the end." William watched her walk away, her words settling uncomfortably in his chest. The courtroom began to fill again, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. This room, once a sanctuary of justice, now felt like a mausoleum to his father's disgrace. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Elijah Carter rose from his seat in the front row. His tailored charcoal suit and commanding presence drew every eye in the room. William watched as the billionaire moved with deliberate steps toward his father, who still sat behind the bench, his weathered hands gripping the edge of his desk. "Your Honor," Elijah's deep voice carried effortlessly through the hushed chamber. "Or should I say, former honor?" A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes remained cold and focused. Judge Tate's face reddened. "Mr. Carter, this is still my courtroom and you will show proper respect." "Respect?" Elijah raised an eyebrow, his composure unwavering. "Like the respect you showed to thousands of young black men when you sentenced them to maximum terms for minor offenses." He pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase. "I have here documented evidence of your, shall we say, pattern of judicial discrimination." William's stomach tightened as he watched his father's fingers drum against the wooden bench. He knew that gesture. It was what his father did when he felt cornered. "These allegations are baseless," Judge Tate declared, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "I've served this community for 30 years. "Served?" Elijah's laugh was sharp and without humor. "You've terrorized this community. You've torn families apart. You've destroyed lives." He opened the folder, removing a single sheet. "Like the case of Marcus Johnson, age 19, first-time offender caught with a small amount of marijuana. You gave him 15 years while sentencing Timothy Brooks, a white defendant with the same charge, to probation the very same day." The whispers started then, rippling through the gallery like wind through dry leaves. William saw his father's jaw clench, a vein pulsing at his temple. "That case was different," Judge Tate began. "They're all different, aren't they?" Elijah interrupted, his voice gaining intensity, but never losing its control. "Every single time you sentenced a black defendant more harshly, you had your reasons, your excuses, your justifications." He laid document after document on the bench. "But the numbers don't lie, Your Honor. The statistics tell a very clear story." William watched as his father seemed to shrink in his chair, the proud man he'd known all his life appearing suddenly smaller, older. But there was something else in his father's eyes, not just defeat, but a flicker of something William had never seen before. "Was it recognition?" Elijah continued, his words precise and measured. "You thought nobody was watching, nobody was counting, nobody would ever hold you accountable." He placed his palms flat on the bench, leaning forward slightly. "But I've been watching, I've been counting, and now everyone will know." The tension in the room was electric. Court officers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. The few remaining lawyers and clerks stood frozen, documents clutched to their chests like shields. Judge Tate's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "You can't prove intent." "Intent?" Elijah's smile widened, but his eyes remained hard. "I don't need to prove intent. The pattern speaks for itself. And thanks to my team of investigators and data analysts, that pattern is now impossible to ignore." William watched as his father's hands, those hands that had once pushed him on a swing, that had signed countless rulings, began to tremble slightly. The morning sun streaming through the high windows seemed to spotlight the scene, casting harsh shadows across his father's face. "What do you want?" Judge Tate asked, his voice hoarse. Elijah straightened, adjusting his tie with deliberate slowness. "Want? I want justice. I want accountability. But most of all, I want you to feel what it's like to be judged unfairly, to have your fate in someone else's hands." He gathered his documents with precise movements. "And trust me, Your Honor, this is just the beginning." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of paper as Elijah methodically returned the documents to his briefcase. The power dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably, and everyone present could feel it. In his chambers, Judge Randolph Tate poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, the crystal decanter clinking against the glass. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the dark wood paneling. He could hear the persistent buzz of voices in the courthouse hallway outside, but here in his sanctuary, he felt untouchable. "Ridiculous display," he muttered, taking a slow sip. The amber liquid burned pleasantly, familiar and reassuring. The morning's confrontation with Elijah Carter played in his mind, but he dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Men like Carter came and went. They made noise, stirred up trouble, but ultimately changed nothing. His private phone line rang, cutting through his thoughts. Tate recognized the mayor's direct line and answered with practiced authority. Judge Tate speaking. "Randolph." Mayor Henderson's voice was clipped, tense. "I need you at City Hall. Now." Tate frowned. "Charles, I have a full docket tomorrow to—" "Now, Randolph. The conference room." The line went dead. Tate stared at the phone, irritation creeping up his spine. He set his drink down harder than necessary, the liquid sloshing against the crystal. 20 minutes later, his town car pulled up to City Hall. The building's classical columns stretched toward the darkening sky, usually a sight that filled him with pride. Today, something felt off. His footsteps echoed through the marble lobby as he made his way to the 3rd floor. The conference room doors were closed, unusual for this time of day. When Tate pushed them open, his confident stride faltered. Around the long mahogany table sat the city's power players, the police chief, the DA, 3 city council members, the head of the bar association. Their faces were grim, avoiding his gaze. But it was the figure at the head of the table that made his stomach clench. Elijah Carter sat in the mayor's usual chair, his presence commanding the room. The mayor himself had taken a seat to Carter's right, looking uncomfortable in the subordinate position. "Judge Tate," Carter said smoothly, "please join us." Tate's mouth went dry. The bourbon in his stomach turned sour. He moved to his usual seat, only to find it occupied by the district attorney. The only empty chair was at the far end of the table, directly opposite Carter. The message wasn't subtle. As Tate lowered himself into the chair, he noticed the folders in front of each person. Thick folders. His hands felt cold as he recognized his own case numbers on the tabs. The room was suffocating. The familiar faces around him now seemed like strangers, their expressions a mix of disappointment and barely concealed anger. The setting sun through the windows cast long shadows across the table, and Tate felt them reaching for him like accusing fingers. Elijah Carter leaned forward slowly, his hands clasped on the table. His voice was quiet but filled the room completely. "Let's talk about what happens next, Judge." The heavy double doors of City Hall's conference room swung open, and Judge Randolph Tate strode in with his usual air of authority. The bourbon's warmth still lingered in his chest, but it did nothing to ease the chill that crept over him as he took in the scene before him. The conference room's mahogany table stretched out like a judge's bench, but this time, he wasn't the one wielding power. Mayor Harrison sat at the head, his typically friendly face now stern and unreadable. Around the table, familiar faces from the city's upper echelons stared back at Tate with cold eyes. Business leaders who had once laughed at his jokes, legal colleagues who had once sought his favor. And there, directly across from his empty chair, sat Elijah Carter. The young lawyer's presence felt like a physical blow. "Judge Tate," Mayor Harrison's voice cut through the silence, "please take a seat." Tate's footsteps echoed against the marble floor as he made his way to the empty chair. The leather creaked under his weight as he sat down, trying to maintain his dignity. "This seems like quite a production for a simple courtroom disagreement," Tate said, forcing a smile that no one returned. City Councilwoman Peters cleared her throat. "Judge Tate, we've received multiple reports about this morning's incident." "Incident?" Tate scoffed. "A young lawyer showed disrespect in my courtroom. I handled it appropriately." "Did you?" Elijah's voice was quiet but carried across the table with devastating clarity. "Is that what you call threatening to destroy my career because I dared to challenge your ruling?" The room grew even more still. Tate felt sweat forming at his collar despite the room's cool air conditioning. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, but found none. Even Bernard Matthews, his golf partner of 15 years, wouldn't meet his eyes. "Now see here," Tate began, but Mayor Harrison raised his hand. "We've reviewed Mr. Carter's evidence," the mayor said, sliding a thick folder across the table, "and we've examined the pattern of your recent rulings." Tate's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Inside were transcripts, court records, and financial documents, all meticulously organized and annotated. His throat went dry as he recognized what he was looking at. "This is a witch hunt," he declared, pushing the folder away. "I've served this city faithfully for decades. My record speaks for itself." "Yes," Elijah said, leaning forward. "It does speak for itself. That's precisely the problem." The young lawyer's calm demeanor only heightened Tate's growing sense of panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was Judge Randolph Tate. He was untouchable. He was Dash. "Your son William is on his way," Mayor Harrison said quietly. "He should be here any minute." The mention of his son's name hit Tate like a physical blow. William. His brilliant, principled son who had followed in his legal footsteps but had grown increasingly distant over the years. William, who had built his own reputation as one of New York's most respected defense attorneys. "William," Tate's voice cracked. "Why would you involve my son in this nonsense?" "Because he asked to be here," Elijah replied. "When we presented him with our findings, he insisted on being present." The conference room doors opened again, and Tate turned to see his son standing there, briefcase in hand, wearing the same expression of disappointment that had become so familiar over the years. But now there was something else in William's eyes, a mixture of sadness and determination that made Tate's stomach clench. "Hello, Father," William said, his voice professional and detached. He took a seat at the far end of the table, as far from Tate as possible while still being part of the proceedings. Elijah Carter leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Let's talk about what happens next, Judge." Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Tate's breakfast room, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The morning paper lay folded beside his untouched Eggs Benedict, his coffee growing cold in its fine bone china cup. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away with merciless precision, each sound echoing through the silent room. Judge Randolph Tate sat rigid in his leather chair, his phone screen glowing with dozens of missed calls and unread messages. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the notifications. Most were from his secretary, but one name made his heart skip: William. His son hadn't called in over 2 years. Not since that heated argument where William had accused him of caring more about his reputation than justice. Now, seeing his son's name flash across the screen felt like both a lifeline and a threat. Tate pushed his plate away, his appetite completely gone. The sterling silver fork clinked against fine china, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet room. Through the windows, he could see his perfectly manicured garden, where his groundskeeper was trimming hedges with practiced precision. Everything looked normal, orderly, just as it had for the past 30 years. But nothing felt normal anymore. His eyes drifted to the morning paper he couldn't bring himself to open. He knew what he'd find inside. His name, his reputation, everything he'd built, probably splashed across the front page. The thought made his chest tight. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared in the doorway. "Judge Tate? Channel 7 News is at the gate again. Should I tell them to leave?" Tate's jaw clenched. "Yes, send them away." "And Mrs. Chen? Hold all my calls today." She hesitated, wringing her hands in her apron. Even the one from your son?" The question hit him like a physical blow. William never called without reason. His son, the crusading defense attorney, who'd built his own reputation fighting for the underdogs, everything Tate had secretly despised. "I'll take William's call in my study," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. As Mrs. Chen left, Tate stood and walked to the window. His reflection stared back at him, still wearing his expensive suit, still looking every bit the respected judge he'd been yesterday. But something had changed in his eyes. The confident gleam had dimmed, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like fear. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from William. "We need to talk. Now." Tate's fingers hovered over the keypad. For the first time in decades, he didn't know what to say. His carefully constructed world of power and influence suddenly felt as fragile as the china cup cooling on his breakfast table. The grandfather clock continued its relentless ticking, counting down the moments until he'd have to face his son, and perhaps, finally, face himself. The morning sun caught the crystal decanter on his sidebar, throwing rainbow patterns across the wall, but even the familiar comfort of a morning drink held no appeal. His phone buzzed again. William wasn't going to wait. The illusion of control, of unshakable authority that Tate had maintained for so long, was cracking like thin ice beneath his feet, and his son's call might just be the final crack that would send him plunging into the cold depths below. The evening shadows crept across Tate's study, darkening the rows of leather-bound law books that had been his constant companions for decades. He sat in his high-backed chair, the desk lamp casting a small circle of light that seemed to emphasize the darkness surrounding him. The room that had always felt like a sanctuary now felt more like a prison. He reached for the crystal decanter of bourbon, his third pour of the evening. The amber liquid caught the lamplight as it splashed into his glass. His phone lay face down on the desk. He couldn't bear to look at it anymore. The constant stream of calls and messages had become too much. William's name kept flashing through his mind. His son, his only child, hadn't answered any of his calls. The last time they'd spoken had been months ago. A terse conversation about a family dinner William had chosen to skip. Now, in his moment of crisis, that distance felt like a chasm. Tate's eyes drifted to the wall of photographs behind his desk. There was William's law school graduation picture, his son standing proud in his cap and gown, but notably standing apart from his father. Another showed William winning his first major case as a defense attorney. The pride Tate had felt that day now mixed with a bitter irony. His son had chosen to defend the innocent while he pushed the thought away and took another sip of bourbon. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, its sound echoing through the empty house. Martha, his housekeeper of 20 years, had left hours ago, leaving behind a dinner he couldn't bring himself to eat. The leather of his chair creaked as he swiveled to face the window. Beyond the manicured lawn, lights twinkled in other homes. Families having dinner, watching TV, living their normal lives. His own home felt cavernous and cold. A stack of case files sat untouched on his desk, tomorrow's docket that he should be reviewing. But the words swam before his eyes whenever he tried to focus. Besides, what was the point? After today's meeting at City Hall, he wasn't sure he'd be presiding over any cases in the near future. The silence was broken by the sound of his own bitter laugh. How quickly things could change. Just yesterday, he had been Judge Randolph Tate, respected pillar of the community. Now, he was becoming something else entirely. He pulled open his desk drawer and withdrew an old photograph worn at the edges. It showed a much younger version of himself, with his arm around William, maybe 10 years old then, both of them grinning at the camera. They'd been fishing at the lake house. William had caught his first base that day, and Tate had never seen him so proud. "What would you think of your old man now, William?" he muttered to the photograph, his voice rough with emotion and bourbon. The study's silence offered no answer, only the steady tick of the clock and the occasional creak of the old house settling around him. The isolation pressed in, as tangible as the darkness beyond his desk lamp's glow. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the empty halls of Tate's mansion. Each strike felt like a hammer hitting his chest. He wandered from room to room, a glass of bourbon in his trembling hand, his footsteps loud against the hardwood floors. The house had never felt so big, so hollow. Family photos lined the walls, moments frozen in time when everything made sense. His eyes lingered on a picture of William's law school graduation. His son stood tall and proud, but had positioned himself slightly away from Tate in the photo. Even then, the distance had been growing. Tate paused in the kitchen, where the marble countertops gleamed coldly under the moonlight streaming through the windows. A week ago, his housekeeper would have been preparing his evening meal here. Now, takeout containers cluttered the pristine surface, evidence of his new, solitary reality. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably another reporter. He'd stopped answering calls days ago. The only one he truly wanted to hear from remained silent. William's number hadn't appeared once. Moving to the living room, Tate sank into his leather armchair. The room still smelled faintly of his wife's favorite vanilla candles, though she'd been gone for years. The massive space, with its vaulted ceilings and expensive furniture, had once hosted countless dinner parties and social gatherings. Now it felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. He picked up the evening newspaper from the side table, though he already knew what it said. His own face stared back at him from the front page, alongside headlines that made his stomach turn. The words blurred as he tried to read them again. The bourbon wasn't helping anymore. It couldn't dull the crushing weight in his chest or silence the thoughts that kept him awake at night. Every creak of the house, every distant car passing by, reminded him of how alone he was. His gaze drifted to the wall of legal awards and certificates, each one carefully framed and arranged. They had meant everything to him once. Now they seemed to mock him, their glass surfaces reflecting the dim light like accusatory eyes. Tate stood up suddenly, unable to sit still. He walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn bathed in moonlight. The gardener wouldn't be coming tomorrow either. One by one, the staff had made excuses, found other positions. He couldn't blame them. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud in the quiet house. He tried to remember the last time he'd heard another human voice in these rooms. Was it the housekeeper's goodbye? Or had it been that reporter who'd somehow gotten past the front gate? His hand shook as he set down the empty glass. The isolation pressed in on him from all sides, as suffocating as the silence. In all his years on the bench, he'd never imagined ending up here, alone in his big house watching his life's work crumble around him. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, making him jump. The sound seemed to emphasize the emptiness surrounding him. He used to have answers for everything, solutions to every problem. But now, standing in his dark house with no one to talk to, no one to turn to, Judge Marcus Tate had no answers at all. The security light flickered on as Tate's car approached his estate's front gate. He punched in the code, watching the wrought iron barriers swing open with their usual mechanical precision. But tonight, something felt different. The familiar drive seemed longer, darker, more threatening. His headlights swept across the manicured lawn, creating strange shadows that danced between the carefully trimmed hedges. The fountain in the center of the circular driveway was silent. He'd forgotten to turn it on this morning. Without its gentle splashing, the property felt dead. Tate pulled up to the garage but didn't press the opener. Instead, he sat in his car, engine idling, and stared at the dark windows of his mansion. The place that had once been his pride now loomed over him like a judge's bench, cold, imposing, ready to pass sentence. A movement caught his eye. Near the side gate, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Tate's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the shape resolved itself into a familiar silhouette. Tall, confident, wearing an expensive suit. William? His son stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the car. Tate hadn't seen him in person for over 2 years, not since that heated argument about a case William thought he'd ruled on unfairly. The memory of their last words still stung. Tate's finger hovered over the window control. Should he roll it down? Get out? Drive away? The choice was taken from him when William began walking toward the car, his shoes crunching on the gravel. The sound of his own heartbeat filled Tate's ears. He'd faced down angry lawyers, hostile witnesses, and threatening defendants, but nothing had ever made him feel as vulnerable as his son's steady approach. William stopped beside the driver's side window. After a moment's hesitation, Tate pressed the button, and the glass slid down with a soft whir. "Hello, Father." William's voice was controlled, professional, the same tone he used in court. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Tate noticed his son wasn't wearing his wedding ring anymore. Another change he hadn't known about. Another piece of his son's life he'd missed while building his own empire of influence. "How did you get past the gate?" Tate asked, immediately regretting how defensive it sounded. "I still remember the code. You never changed it, Mom's birthday." William's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "Though I suppose there are a lot of things you never bothered to change." The security light cast harsh shadows across both their faces, highlighting the similarities in their features while emphasizing the gulf between them. Father and son, cut from the same cloth but sewn into entirely different patterns. "I've been following the news," William continued, "watching your name get dragged through the mud, seeing everything you built start to crumble." He paused, adjusting his tie, a nervous habit he'd picked up in law school. "I kept waiting for you to reach out to explain your side of things, but you didn't, just like always." Tate's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. The engine's idle was the only sound breaking the tense silence. He could smell his son's cologne, the same brand he'd given him for his first court appearance. That felt like a lifetime ago. "William, Tate started, but his son held up a hand. "Save it. I'm not here for apologies or excuses." William's voice hardened. "I'm here because tomorrow, the State Bar Association is opening a formal investigation into your conduct. As the youngest partner in my firm's history, I've been asked to assist in the review." The words hit Tate like physical blows. His own son, part of the investigation that could end his career. The ultimate betrayal, or perhaps, he thought bitterly, the ultimate justice. The security light flickered on as Tate's car approached his estate's front gate. He punched in the code, watching the wrought iron barriers swing open with their usual mechanical precision. But tonight, something felt different. The familiar drive seemed longer, darker, more threatening. His headlights swept across the manicured lawn, creating strange shadows that danced between the carefully trimmed hedges. The fountain in the center of the circular driveway was silent. He'd forgotten to turn it on this morning. Without its gentle splashing, the property felt dead. As he pulled up to the garage, movement caught his eye. A figure stood near the front steps, barely visible in the dim porch light. Tate's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His security system should have alerted him to any visitors. He recognized the tall, lean silhouette before the man stepped into the light. William, his son. Tate's throat went dry. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since William had taken that job at the public defender's office, a choice Tate had called beneath the family name. He parked the car but didn't get out right away. Through the windshield, he could see William's face, so like his own at that age, but harder somehow. Colder. The boy who once ran to greet him at this very driveway now stood like a stranger, hands in his pockets, waiting. Tate's fingers trembled slightly as he gathered his briefcase. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain on his own property. For decades, he'd walked these grounds like a king in his castle. Now, facing his son, he felt like an intruder. The car door seemed unusually heavy as he pushed it open. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of fall leaves and something else. Change, perhaps. His footsteps crunched on the gravel, each step echoing in the silence. "William," Tate said, trying to sound casual. "This is unexpected." His son didn't move from his spot on the steps. "Hello, Father." William's voice was level, professional, the voice he probably used with difficult clients. "I saw the news." Of course he had. Everyone had. Tate straightened his shoulders, an old habit from the bench. "If you're here to lecture me, I'm not." William's interruption was quiet but firm. "I'm here because I want to understand something." The porch light cast harsh shadows across William's face, making him look older than his 35 years. Tate noticed the new lines around his son's eyes, the slight gray at his temples. When had that happened? "All those years," William continued. "All those times you talked about justice, about the law being sacred. Was any of it real?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds. Tate opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain about necessary compromises and the complexity of the real world. But looking at his son's face, earnest, disappointed, so damnably righteous. The words died in his throat. "You taught me that justice matters more than anything," William said. "That's why I became a lawyer. That's why I chose to defend people who couldn't afford fancy attorneys. And all this time..." He shook his head. "All this time, you were everything you taught me to fight against." Tate felt something crack inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built, the justifications he'd constructed, they crumbled under his son's steady gaze. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt truly exposed. William turned to go, pausing at the top of the steps. "Mom would have been ashamed," he said softly. Then he walked away, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Tate stood alone in his driveway, watching his son's car disappear through the iron gates. The security light clicked off, plunging him into shadow. In the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing across his empty kingdom. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown high-rise, but its warmth couldn't penetrate the icy atmosphere inside the boardroom. Tate sat alone at one end of the long glass table, his usual confidence wavering under the cold stares of the board members. William, his son, sat at the opposite end, his face a mask of professional detachment. The conversation from last night still rang in Tate's ears, William's quiet but firm declaration that he would no longer stand by while his father's actions tainted their family name. "The numbers don't lie, Judge Tate," said Margaret Chen, the head of the investment group. She slid a folder across the polished surface. "Your position on our board has become problematic." Tate's hand trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Spreadsheets and graphs filled the pages, showing steep downward trends. Client withdrawals, canceled contracts. His connection to their firm, once a symbol of prestige, had transformed into a liability overnight. "This is temporary," Tate said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "A minor setback. The media will move on to something else soon enough." Robert Fletcher, a silver-haired veteran of corporate law, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Judge, this goes beyond media coverage. We've received formal inquiries from 3 regulatory bodies since yesterday morning." The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background as silence fell over the room. Tate looked around at the faces he'd known for years, people who used to laugh at his jokes, who once competed for his attention at charity galas. Now they wouldn't meet his eyes. "I've brought stability to this board for 15 years, Tate reminded them, struggling to keep the desperation from his voice. "My connections, my influence, are precisely the problem," William interrupted, his professional tone cutting deeper than anger would have. "The board has already voted, Father. We're merely extending you the courtesy of hearing it in person." Tate's chest tightened. He hadn't even been invited to the vote. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They'd planned this while he was still believing he could control the situation. Sandra Martinez, the newest board member, spoke up. "Your resignation letter has been drafted. All it needs is your signature." She pushed another document forward, the stark white paper seeming to glow under the recessed lighting. Tate stared at the paper, his vision blurring slightly. The morning sun continued its journey across the sky, casting long shadows through the windows. The city sprawled below, carrying on as if nothing had changed, while his world crumbled in this sterile room. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we move to a formal removal," William replied, his words precise and measured, "which would require us to make public our reasons, all of them." The threat hung in the air. Tate looked at his son, searching for any hint of the little boy who once proudly told everyone his daddy was a judge. He found only a composed executive protecting his company's interests. The leather chair creaked as Tate reached for the resignation letter. His golden pen, a gift from this very board on his 10th anniversary, felt heavy in his hand. Each stroke of his signature felt like another piece of his carefully constructed world falling away. No one spoke as he stood, straightening his jacket out of habit. The familiar gesture felt hollow now, like an actor performing to an empty theater. He walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "The security team will escort you out," William said softly. "Standard protocol for departing board members." Tate nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Outside the boardroom, two men in dark suits waited. As they led him toward the elevator, he caught his reflection in the polished doors, a man he barely recognized anymore. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across crumbling sidewalks as Tate's Mercedes crawled through streets he'd never had reason to visit before. Broken windows stared down at him like accusatory eyes, while faded storefronts advertised check-cashing services and discount liquor. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Just hours ago, he'd sat in that sterile boardroom, watching his son's back as William walked out without a backward glance. Now, desperately seeking somewhere, anywhere to clear his head, he'd driven aimlessly until the manicured lawns of his neighborhood had given way to this forgotten corner of the city. A group of children kicked a deflated ball in a weedy lot between buildings. They paused their game to watch his car pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Tate felt suddenly conscious of his vehicle's gleaming paint, its leather seats, the gold watch on his wrist. He pulled into a small parking lot beside a dingy convenience store. The concrete was cracked, with stubborn weeds pushing through. A middle-aged woman struggled with several plastic bags as she left the store, her uniform suggesting she'd just finished a shift at one of the fast food chains. Tate watched as she juggled her bags, nearly dropping them. Without thinking, he stepped out of his car. "Let me help you with those." She froze, clutching her purchases closer. "I'm fine," she said quickly, hurrying past him. The rejection stung more than it should have. He'd offered help, real help, for the first time in... he couldn't remember how long, and she'd looked at him like he was a threat. The convenience store's bell jingled as he pushed through the door. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on nearly empty shelves. A teenage clerk looked up from his phone, then quickly back down. Tate wandered the aisles, noting the dented cans, the off-brand cereals, the carefully handwritten price tags. A young mother counted coins at the counter, her little girl clutching a small carton of milk. The total came to more than she had. Without a word, she started to put items back. His hand moved toward his wallet, but he stopped. He remembered similar scenes in his courtroom, people explaining late rent payments, missed child support, unpaid tickets. He'd shown no mercy then, had he? Had even taken pride in being tough but fair, as the papers used to say. Through the grimy window, he could see an elderly man sleeping on a bench, a threadbare blanket pulled tight around his shoulders. How many times had Tate enforced ordinances against vagrant behavior? How many times had he dismissed pleas about circumstances, about bad luck, about one mistake snowballing into disaster? The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter, more accusing. In his courtroom, these people had been case numbers, statistics, problems to be solved with firm sentences and strict interpretations of the law. But here in their world, they were just people trying to survive. A small TV mounted in the corner played the local news. Tate's own face appeared briefly, another story about his downfall. The clerk glanced between the screen and Tate, recognition dawning in his eyes. Tate hurried out, the bell's cheerful jingle now seeming to mock him. Back in his car, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The leather seats felt obscenely comfortable. The air conditioning whispered soothingly. Everything about his vehicle screamed of privilege, of separation from the world outside. He'd spent decades looking down from his bench, certain of his righteousness, his judgment. But he'd never truly seen the people he was judging, had he? Never understood the weight of the world they carried, the razor's edge they walked between survival and disaster. The sun was setting now, painting the broken neighborhood in shades of orange and purple. Through his windshield, Tate watched as the woman with the grocery bags finally made it to her destination, a rundown apartment building with a broken front step. She carefully maneuvered around it, disappearing inside with her burdens. The buzzing neon sign outside the motel window cast an intermittent red glow across the worn carpet. Tate sat on the edge of the sagging bed, his expensive suit jacket draped over a chair that had seen better days. The room smelled of old cigarettes and cheap cleaning products, but he barely noticed anymore. His phone lay silent on the nightstand. No calls, no messages, not that he expected any. William's words from earlier that day echoed in his mind. "You're not the man I thought you were." The truth of that statement hit differently now. here in this shabby room than it had in that glossy boardroom. Tate stood and walked to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain. Below, a couple hurried through the parking lot, clutching each other against the cold. They looked tired, worn down by life, but they had each other. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a stranger in expensive clothes, alone. The faces from the community center flashed through his memory. The elderly woman with arthritis who couldn't afford her medication. The single father working 3 jobs to keep his kids fed. The teenage girl who'd dropped out of school to care for her sick mother. All of them had stood before his bench at some point, and he'd looked right through them. "Order in the court," he whispered to his reflection, the phrase tasting bitter now. What order had he really maintained? What justice had he served? He turned away from the window and sank into the room's only chair. His wallet sat open on the scratched table, and from it, he pulled out an old photograph. William, age 10, beaming up at him after winning his school's mock trial competition. "I want to be just like you, Dad," he'd said that day. The photograph blurred as tears, his first in years, welled up in his eyes. He'd been so proud that day, watching his son follow in his footsteps. Now those same footsteps had led William to turn his back on him. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. In his old life, such sounds were just background noise, meaningless to his comfortable existence. Now each one made him wonder. Was it someone he'd sentenced too harshly? A family he'd helped tear apart? A life he'd made harder instead of easier? The weight of these thoughts pressed down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He loosened his tie, the silk smooth against his fingers, probably worth more than what some people in this neighborhood made in a week. The realization made him want to tear it off, but he just let his hands fall limply to his sides. For the first time in decades, Judge Harrison Tate felt truly small, not just humbled, but stripped bare of all the pretenses he'd built around himself. The gavel, the robes, the power, they had become his armor, his identity. Without them, who was he? The answer came with crushing clarity. He was just a man who'd lost his way, a father who'd disappointed his son, a judge who'd forgotten the meaning of justice. He reached for his phone, finger hovering over William's number. But what would he say? "I'm sorry," felt inadequate, a band-aid on a wound that required surgery. No, words weren't enough anymore. Something had to change. He had to change. The clock on the nightstand blinked 11:43 p.m. Outside, the city continued its nighttime rhythm of distant traffic and occasional voices. But inside this small, shabby room, something was shifting. The anger that had fueled him since his fall from grace was draining away, leaving behind something harder to face. The truth about himself. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead as Tate stared at his reflection in the spotted motel mirror. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually pristine silver hair stuck out at odd angles. The steady drip from the leaky faucet marked time like a broken metronome. He splashed cold water on his face, the shock making him gasp. The threadbare towel felt rough against his skin, so different from the Egyptian cotton he was used to at home. Home. The word felt hollow now. Bracing his hands on either side of the sink, he forced himself to really look at his reflection. The face staring back at him wasn't the confident, commanding presence he'd cultivated over decades. Instead, he saw an old man tired and lost. "What have you become?" he whispered to his reflection. The dripping faucet answered with another hollow plunk. The bathroom's cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper seemed to mock everything he'd once represented. Here, in this shabby room, there were no mahogany panels or leather-bound law books to hide behind. No gavel to silence opposition. No power to wield like a shield. Yesterday's visit to the community center had stripped away his last defenses. The faces of those people he'd dismissed for years as mere statistics in his courtroom, now haunted him. Their stories of struggle and resilience had cut through decades of carefully constructed justifications. He thought of Maria, the young mother who'd lost her home because of one of his rulings. She didn't cry when she told her story. She stood tall, her chin held high, even as she described sleeping in her car with her children. Her dignity in the face of injustice made his own actions seem even more shameful. The faucet dripped again, and Tate reached out with trembling fingers to tighten it. The knob was loose, worn from years of use, but he managed to stop the dripping. If only his conscience could be silenced so easily. His designer watch lay on the edge of the sink, a $20,000 timepiece that suddenly seemed obscene. How many families could that money have helped? How many lives could have been changed if he'd chosen compassion over convenience, justice over expedience? The morning light was beginning to seep through the small bathroom window, casting long shadows across the floor. Tate ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign. The man who had meticulously groomed himself in front of gilt-edged mirrors seemed like a stranger now. He remembered the community center's director, Sarah, and her quiet assessment of him. "Judge Tate," she'd said, "power isn't just about what you can do to people. It's about what you can do for people." At the time, he'd bristled at her words. Now, in the cold light of dawn, they felt like a lifeline. The bathroom's mirror had a crack running through it, splitting his reflection in two. It felt appropriate. The man he'd been, and the man he might become, divided by this moment of truth. The drip had started again, softer now, like a persistent reminder that some things couldn't be ignored forever. His hands gripped the edge of the sink until his knuckles turned white. For the first time in decades, Judge Richard Tate allowed himself to feel the full weight of his choices. The faces of countless people he'd sentenced, evicted, or dismissed flooded his mind. Not as case numbers or legal precedents, but as human beings, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dignity. The morning light grew stronger, filling the small bathroom with an unforgiving clarity. There was nowhere left to hide, no justifications left to make. In this dingy motel bathroom, with its dripping faucet and cracked mirror, Judge Richard Tate finally faced the truth about himself, and the man he had become. The fluorescent lights of the small news station felt harsh and unforgiving. Tate shifted uncomfortably in the metal folding chair, tugging at his collar. The makeup artist had done her best to hide his exhaustion, but he could still feel the weight of sleepless nights pulling at his features. "3 minutes until we're live," called out the producer, a young woman with clipboard in hand. Across from him sat Sarah Chen, a local reporter known for her unflinching interviews. Her dark eyes studied him with quiet intensity as the crew made final adjustments to their microphones. "Remember our agreement," came Elijah's voice from behind the cameras. He stood with arms crossed, his presence both reassuring and threatening. "Complete honesty, Judge Tate. These people deserve nothing less." Tate's throat felt dry. For decades, he'd commanded respect from behind his bench, but now he sat exposed under these bright lights, about to confess his sins to the world. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them in his lap. 30 seconds, called the producer. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Are you ready, Judge Tate?" No, he wasn't ready. How could anyone be ready to dismantle their entire life's facade? But he nodded anyway. 10 seconds, 5, 4, 3. The producer counted down silently with her fingers. The red light blinked on, and Sarah's professional smile appeared. "Good morning, I'm Sarah Chen. Today we have a special guest, former Judge Richard Tate, who has requested this interview to address recent controversies surrounding his time on the bench. Judge Tate, thank you for being here." Tate cleared his throat. "Thank you for having me, Sarah." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, smaller, less certain. "Let's start with the incident that brought these issues to light. 2 weeks ago, in your courtroom." As Sarah spoke, Tate caught Elijah's eye. The man's expression was unreadable, but his presence served as a reminder. This wasn't about saving face or minimizing damage. This was about truth, about acknowledging the lives he'd impacted through years of biased rulings. "Yes," Tate interrupted, surprising both Sarah and himself with his directness. "I made a terrible mistake that day, but it wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of failing to see my own prejudices." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting this immediate admission. "Could you elaborate on that?" Tate felt sweat beading on his forehead under the hot lights. He could see the cameraman zoom in slightly, capturing every detail of his discomfort. But for the first time in his career, he wasn't trying to project authority or control the narrative. For 27 years, I sat on that bench believing I was serving justice. But I wasn't. I was serving my own narrow view of the world. I looked at young black men and saw threats instead of human beings. I handed down harsher sentences based on nothing more than the color of someone's skin or their economic status. The words felt like stones in his mouth, but he forced them out. In the corner of his eye, he saw Elijah give a small nod of encouragement. I ruined lives, Tate continued, his voice cracking slightly. I separated families. I sent young people to prison who deserved second chances, and I did it all while telling myself I was being fair and impartial. Sarah leaned forward, her professional detachment softening slightly. What made you decide to come forward with this now? Tate glanced again at Elijah, remembering the harsh lessons of the past 2 weeks. Someone showed me the truth about myself. Someone forced me to see the real impact of my actions. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. You can't continue pretending. The city lights twinkled like stars beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elijah Carter's penthouse office. Tate stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, staring at the man who had systematically dismantled his life. That interview was a setup, Tate spat, his voice trembling with rage. You knew exactly what questions she would ask. Elijah sat behind his massive desk, perfectly composed in his tailored charcoal suit. He didn't even look up from the document he was reading. I arranged the interview. I never promised you softball questions. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Tate took a step forward, his face flushed, watching me squirm, making me relive every decision. Finally, Elijah looked up. His dark eyes were cold, calculating. Enjoying it? Number. But someone needed to make you face what you've done. I was doing my job? Tate slammed his palm against Elijah's desk. The sound echoed through the minimalist office space. Your job? Elijah's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the surface. Your job was to serve justice, not destroy lives because of your prejudices. You don't know what it's like making those decisions, don't I? Elijah stood slowly, his presence filling the room. My father spent 15 years in prison because of a judge just like you, a man who saw his skin color before his humanity. Tate's breath caught in his throat. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. You think this is about revenge? Elijah continued, walking around his desk. This is about justice, real justice, the kind you failed to deliver for decades. I can't change the past, Tate's voice cracked with desperation. No, Elijah agreed. But you can face it. Every person you sentenced unfairly, every family you tore apart, every life you derailed because you couldn't see past your own biases. Tate stumbled backward until he hit the window. The city sprawled below him, vast and indifferent to his turmoil. What do you want from me? I want you to break, Elijah said simply, because only then can you begin to understand the weight of what you've done. Only then can you truly change. The words landed like hammer blows. Tate's carefully constructed defenses began to crack. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since this ordeal began, tears pricked at his eyes. My son won't even speak to me, he whispered. William is a good man, Elijah said. Better than you were. He understands what real justice looks like. Tate's legs gave out, and he sank into one of the leather chairs. The fight drained from him, leaving only exhaustion and a growing horror at his own actions. How many? He asked hoarsely. How many lives did I destroy? Elijah walked to a cabinet and pulled out a thick file. He dropped it on the desk with a heavy thud. Start reading. These are just the cases we've reviewed so far. Tate stared at the file, his hands shaking. Each page represented a person, a family, a future he had carelessly altered. The weight of it was overwhelming. I can't, he started. You can, Elijah cut him off, and you will, because this isn't about you anymore, this is about them, all of them. The city continued to sparkle beyond the windows, but Tate no longer saw its beauty. All he could see were the shadows, the places where people struggled because of men like him. The realization was like acid in his chest, burning away the last of his pride. The neon beer signs cast a sickly glow across the scratched wooden bar top. Tate nursed his third whiskey, barely noticing the sticky residue his glass left on the surface. The bar was nearly empty, just him, a couple of regulars slumped in dark corners, and a tired-looking bartender wiping down glasses. "Another?" the bartender asked, eyeing Tate's nearly empty glass. Tate nodded without looking up. His suit, once pristine, was wrinkled and stained. His tie hung loose around his neck. He barely recognized himself in the smudged mirror behind the bar. The interview had been bad enough, but Elijah's cold satisfaction afterward, that's what really got to him. The way he'd calmly explained how every single person Tate had wrongly convicted would get their story told, how their families would speak about years of suffering, how the whole city would finally see the truth. The fresh whiskey arrived. Tate took a long swallow, welcoming the burn. "You look like you're having one hell of a day," the bartender commented, leaning against the counter. Tate let out a bitter laugh. "Try one hell of a month." He ran his fingers through his disheveled gray hair. "Ever have your whole life fall apart? Everything you built, everything you thought you were, just gone?" The bartender shrugged. "Can't say I have, but I've seen plenty of folks in here trying to drink away their problems." "Does it work?" Tate asked, already knowing the answer. "Never does." The bartender went back to his glasses. Tate stared into his drink, seeing his distorted reflection in the amber liquid. All those years on the bench, he'd been so sure of himself, so certain he was doing the right thing, keeping those people off the streets. Now those words made him sick to his stomach. The faces of those he'd sentenced flashed through his mind. Young men who'd barely started their lives, mothers torn from their children, families destroyed by his gavel. He'd never bothered to really see them before. Now he couldn't stop seeing them. His phone buzzed. A text from William. "Saw your interview. Don't contact me." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He blinked them away angrily, but the crushing weight in his chest remained. His own son couldn't even look at him. A news report played quietly on the bar's old TV. Someone had muted the sound, but Tate could see his own face from that morning's interview. He looked defensive, angry, exactly like the man he'd always been, the man he was finally starting to hate. "Hey," he called to the bartender. "Can you turn that off?" The TV went dark, but the silence felt even worse. Now there was nothing to distract him from the voice in his head, the one that kept whispering the truth. He deserved this. All of it. He'd spent decades passing judgment on others, never once questioning his own prejudices, his own cruelty. Now Elijah Carter was making sure he faced every ugly truth about himself, and Tate was drowning in the reality of who he really was. The whiskey wasn't helping anymore, nothing was. He pulled out his wallet and threw some crumpled bills on the bar, not bothering to count them. "You good to drive?" the bartender asked. "Called a car," Tate mumbled, though he hadn't. He'd figure something out. Right now, he just needed to escape the suffocating walls of this bar, the weight of his own thoughts. He stumbled slightly as he stood, his expensive shoes scuffing against the dirty floor. The few other patrons didn't even look up as he made his way to the door. Just another broken man in a bar full of them. The night air hit him like a slap, but he barely felt it. Everything was numb now, everything except the shame that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in his chest. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in cold grays as Tate's eyes fluttered open. His head pounded, and the taste in his mouth was bitter and stale. He tried to move, but his muscles screamed in protest. The rough wooden slats of the park bench had left deep marks on his cheek and arm. Empty bottles lay scattered at his feet, glinting dully in the pre-dawn light. His expensive suit was ruined, covered in dirt, grass stains, and what looked like dried vomit. One shoe was missing entirely. An early morning jogger passed by, giving him a wide berth and a disgusted look. Tate tried to sit up, but the world spun violently. He clutched the bench's armrest, fighting back another wave of nausea. "Look what we have here," a gruff voice said. Tate's bleary eyes focused on a homeless man pushing a shopping cart filled with cans and cardboard. "Rough night, fancy man." Tate tried to muster some dignity but failed miserably as he dry heaved over the side of the bench. The homeless man chuckled without malice. "First time sleeping rough?" he asked, parking his cart and sitting on the other end of the bench. "Name's Pete. Been calling this park home for about 3 years now." Tate wanted to tell Pete to leave him alone, to maintain some last shred of his former authority. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears began rolling down his cheeks, hot and shameful. "I used to be somebody," Tate whispered, his voice cracking. "I was Judge Tate. People feared me, respected me." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "Heard about you on the news. You're that judge who got caught taking bribes, right? The one who sent all those poor folks to jail to help his rich friends?" Each word hit Tate like a physical blow. He doubled over, holding his head in his hands. His expensive watch, the last remnant of his former life, caught the growing light. It seemed to mock him now. "My son won't even talk to me," Tate admitted, the alcohol still loosening his tongue. "William. He's a lawyer too. A good one. Better than I ever was." His voice broke completely. "He changed his last name, said he couldn't bear to be associated with me anymore." Pete pulled a half-empty water bottle from his cart and offered it to Tate. "Here, you look like you need it more than me right now." Tate stared at the bottle, then at Pete's weathered face. Just days ago, he would have sneered at such an offer. Now, with trembling hands, he accepted it gratefully. "You know what's funny?" Pete said, watching Tate take small sips. "Most folks think hitting rock bottom is the worst thing that can happen to them. But sometimes, it's exactly what we need. Can't rebuild until the old foundation's completely torn down." A police car cruised by slowly, its occupants studying the odd pair on the bench. Tate instinctively tried to shrink into himself, to become invisible. The same officers who once saluted him now viewed him as just another drunk in the park. The sun was rising properly now, casting long shadows across the littered grass. Tate's head still pounded, but a different kind of pain was taking hold, the deep ache of reality setting in. He looked down at his ruined clothes, at the empty bottles, at his trembling hands, and saw himself clearly for the first time in years. "What have I become?" he whispered, more to himself than to Pete. Pete stood up, gripping the handle of his cart. "That's the right question to be asking, friend. But maybe the better question is, what are you going to become now?" The bright lights of the press conference room felt like daggers in Tate's bloodshot eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his borrowed tie. Elijah had insisted he couldn't wear his stained clothes from the night before. The clean but simple navy suit felt foreign on his body, so different from his usual expensive attire. Cameras clicked and whirred. Dozens of reporters filled the rows of seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Tate could feel their stares burning into him as he stood at the podium, his mouth dry as sandpaper. Elijah Carter stood off to the side, his presence both intimidating and oddly reassuring. His face revealed nothing, but his eyes never left Tate. "Thank you all for coming," Tate began, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat and tried again. The prepared statement in front of him suddenly seemed inadequate, empty, false. He looked up at the crowd, seeing faces he'd dismissed countless times from his bench, reporters he'd barred from his courtroom, people whose lives he'd impacted with the casual bang of his gavel. "I've spent decades believing I was serving justice," he continued, pushing the prepared remarks aside. "I convinced myself that being tough on crime meant being tough on criminals, that showing mercy was a sign of weakness." His hands gripped the podium tighter. In the corner of his eye, he saw Elijah shift slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "Yesterday, I woke up on a park bench drunk and alone." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it means to have nothing, to be at the mercy of others' judgment." The cameras continued clicking, but the room had grown eerily still. "I've sentenced thousands of people during my career. Many deserved punishment, yes, But how many deserved a chance at redemption that I denied them? How many lives did I destroy because I couldn't see past my own prejudices? Tate's voice cracked. He took a sip of water, his hand shaking visibly now. I can't undo those rulings. I can't give back the years I stole from people who needed help more than punishment. But I can stand here today and admit that I was wrong. That I failed in my duty not just as a judge, but as a human being. A reporter's hand shot up, but Tate wasn't finished. To every person who stood before me and begged for understanding, I failed you. To every family I torn apart with excessive sentences, I failed you. To every community I helped destabilize through my harsh rulings, I failed you. He looked directly at Elijah now, seeing something shift in the man's expression. I don't expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for the chance to make things right. Starting today, I'm establishing a foundation, using my personal fortune to provide legal assistance to those I wrongfully sentenced, to help reunite families separated by my decisions, to support communities I helped destroy. The room erupted with questions, cameras flashing frantically, but Tate wasn't done. He turned to face Elijah directly. Mr. Carter, you showed me the truth about myself in the harshest way possible. You stripped away everything I had until I could finally see who I really was. Thank you. Elijah's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes had softened ever so slightly. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Tate turned back to the microphones, his voice stronger now. I'm ready to take your questions, and for the first time in my life, I promise to answer them honestly. Tate sat on the edge of the hotel bed, his eyes fixed on the massive TV screen mounted on the wall. The afternoon sun filtered through gauzy curtains, casting long shadows across the plush carpet. His confession played on repeat across every major news channel, his own face, haggard and humbled, staring back at him. In a shocking turn of events, the news anchor's voice filled the room. Former Judge Theodore Tate made a public admission of wrongdoing this morning. He watched himself again, standing at the podium, his voice cracking as he spoke words he never thought he'd say. I was wrong. For years I abused my position of power. I hurt people, good people who deserved justice but received only my contempt. Tate's hand shook as he reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. The ice had long since melted, leaving the water lukewarm and tasteless. His throat felt raw from speaking, from the countless cigarettes he'd chain-smoked since leaving the press conference. His phone lay silent on the bed beside him. No calls, no messages, not even from his closest associates, though he supposed he didn't have those anymore. The only person who had contacted him was Elijah, sending a simple text. It's done. The TV switched to a panel of legal experts discussing the implications of his confession. Words like investigation and consequences floated through the air. One commentator, a silver-haired woman he'd once shared dinner with at a charity gala, spoke with barely concealed satisfaction about the possibility of criminal charges. Tate stood up, pacing the length of the suite. The room was nice, not luxurious like he was used to, but clean and comfortable. Elijah had arranged it, insisting Tate needed a neutral space to process everything. The gesture had surprised him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. A breaking news alert caught his attention. The screen showed William, his son, leaving his law office. Reporters swarmed around him, microphones thrust toward his face. Mr. Tate, your father's confession, any comment? William's face remained carefully neutral, his expensive suit immaculate, so like the man Tate had once been. No comment at this time, William said firmly, pushing through the crowd. Tate's chest tightened. He hadn't spoken to William in months, not since the scandal first broke. His son had distanced himself immediately, protecting his own reputation. Tate couldn't blame him. Hadn't he taught William that very lesson? Success at any cost, reputation above all else. The irony wasn't lost on him. His reflection in the hotel window caught his eye. He barely recognized himself. Gone was the imperious judge who struck fear into hearts with a mere glance. Instead, he saw an old man, tired and uncertain, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit. The news cycle continued its relentless coverage. Social media reactions scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Some expressed shock at his admission, others demanded prosecution. A few, a very few, acknowledged his courage in coming forward. But was it courage? Or just desperation? Tate wasn't sure anymore. The certainty that had driven his life for decades had crumbled, leaving him adrift in unfamiliar waters. He switched off the TV, unable to watch anymore. The sudden silence felt oppressive. From his window on the 20th floor, he could see the courthouse where he'd presided for so many years. The building looked different now, less like a symbol of his power and more like a monument to his failures. A gentle knock at the door made him jump, probably hotel staff with the lunch he hadn't ordered. He ignored it, turning back to the window. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Dad?" William's voice, clear and hesitant, froze Tate in place. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the door, unsure whether to open it or pretend he wasn't there. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elijah Carter's office, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Tate sat in one of the leather chairs facing the massive desk, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft hum of the building's air conditioning. Elijah stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the city skyline. He hadn't said a word since Tate arrived 10 minutes ago. The waiting was worse than any verbal attack could have been. Finally, Elijah turned. His dark suit was impeccable, his presence commanding as always. But there was something different in his eyes today. Not the cold anger Tate had grown used to, but something more contemplative. "Your confession yesterday," Elijah began, his voice measured, "surprised a lot of people." He walked slowly to his desk, each step deliberate. "Some say it was just another performance, a desperate attempt to save what's left of your reputation." Tate's throat felt dry. "It wasn't." "No?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Prove it." "How?" Tate's voice cracked. The past weeks had stripped away his arrogance, leaving behind a man he barely recognized. Elijah sat down, folding his hands on the desk. "I'm going to give you a chance to make things right. Not for your sake, but for theirs." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Send them in." The office door opened and 3 people walked in. Tate recognized them immediately, families of those he'd sentenced unjustly. His stomach clenched. "These people," Elijah said softly, "lost years with their loved ones because of your decisions, because you saw them as less than human, because their lives meant nothing to you." A woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, stepped forward. "My son," she said, her voice trembling, "missed watching his children grow up because you gave him 10 years for a crime he didn't commit." Tate couldn't meet her eyes. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him like a physical thing. "You're going to help them," Elijah stated. It wasn't a question. "You're going to use your connections, your knowledge of the system, to get their cases reopened. You're going to work with their lawyers, pro bono. You're going to face every single family you've wronged." The magnitude of the task made Tate's head spin. There were hundreds of cases, hundreds of families. It would take years. "And," Elijah continued, his voice hardening, "you're going to do it without complaint, without excuses, without expecting anything in return." He leaned forward. "This isn't about redemption, Judge Tate. This is about justice. Real justice, not the twisted version you dealt out from your bench." The 3 families stood silently, their presence a testament to the lives he'd carelessly destroyed. Tate felt the full weight of their pain, their lost years, their shattered dreams. "Do you accept?" Elijah asked. Tate looked at the families again, really looked at them. The elderly woman with her quiet dignity. The middle-aged man holding his wife's hand so tightly his knuckles were white. The young woman who couldn't be more than 25, probably there on behalf of a parent or sibling. "Yes," Tate whispered, then cleared his throat and said it again, stronger. "Yes, I accept." Elijah nodded once, then opened a drawer and pulled out a thick stack of files. "These are just the beginning. Each one represents a family waiting for justice." He pushed them across the desk. Don't make me regret this opportunity. The governor's office was intimidating in its grandeur, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb what little morning light filtered through the heavy curtains. Tate stood near the window, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand, watching staff members hurry past in the hallway outside. His heart pounded against his ribs. The familiar weight of his suit felt different today, less like armor and more like chains. The stack of files in his briefcase contained evidence of decades of injustice, including his own. Cases where money had spoken louder than truth, where influence had outweighed evidence. A young aide approached him, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "The governor will see you now, Mr. Tate." Tate nodded, swallowing hard. His throat felt dry. Just yesterday, he would have walked into this office with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Now, he felt like an outsider, and maybe that was exactly what he needed to be. Governor Richardson sat behind his massive desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. He didn't look up immediately when Tate entered. The power play was obvious, but Tate no longer cared about such games. "Judge Tate," the governor finally said, removing his glasses. "Or should I say, former Judge Tate. Please, have a seat." Tate settled into one of the leather chairs, placing his briefcase on his lap. His hands were trembling slightly, and he pressed them flat against the leather to steady them. "Sir, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Tate began, his voice rougher than he'd expected. "Let's be clear," Governor Richardson interrupted, leaning forward. "The only reason you're here is because certain people insisted I give you 5 minutes. Your reputation precedes you, Tate, and not in a good way anymore." The old Tate would have bristled at this, would have pulled rank or made threats. Instead, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. "You're right," he said simply. "My reputation is exactly why I'm here." He opened his briefcase and pulled out the first file. "This is the Carter case from 15 years ago, the one that started everything with Elijah. But it's not just about him anymore." The governor's eyebrows rose slightly as Tate placed file after file on the desk. Each one represented a life affected by corruption, by the system that Tate had helped maintain for so long. "These cases," Tate's voice cracked slightly, "they're not just papers. They're people, families, communities. And I was part of the problem. But now I want to be part of the solution." Governor Richardson picked up one of the files, flipping through it with a frown. "You realize what you're doing? The people you're implicating?" "Yes," Tate replied, his voice steady now. "Including myself. Especially myself." The morning light had grown stronger, cutting through the heavy curtains in sharp beams. Tate could see dust motes dancing in the air between them, like all the secrets he was about to expose. "I'm not here to make deals or protect myself," he continued. "I'm here because these wrongs need to be made right, and you're the only one with the power to start that process." The governor leaned back in his chair, studying Tate with calculating eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Everything Tate had built his life around, power, influence, control, sat in those files on the governor's desk. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to let it all go for something more important. The choice lay before him like a crossroads. He could still walk away, try to salvage what was left of his old life. Or he could step forward into uncertainty, knowing only that it was the right thing to do. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead in Tate's cramped office at the Legal Aid Center. The space was a far cry from his former chambers, just a metal desk, 2 mismatched chairs, and a small window overlooking a brick wall. A stack of case files sat before him, but his mind wandered to the governor's office and the pardon request he'd submitted a week ago. His fingers drummed against the worn desktop. The waiting was the hardest part. Each time footsteps passed his door, his heart jumped, expecting news. But none came. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, straightening in his chair. Maria, one of the center's paralegals, poked her head in. "Mr. Tate, your son is here." Tate's breath caught in his throat. William hadn't spoken to him in months, not since the scandal broke. "Send him in," he managed to say, his voice barely steady. William entered looking exactly as Tate remembered, tall and distinguished in his tailored suit, every bit the successful attorney he'd become. But there was something different in his eyes, something less harsh than the last time they'd met. "Hello, Father," William said, remaining by the door. "William." Tate gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." His son hesitated before taking the seat. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. "I saw your presentation to the governor," William finally said, "about the wrongful convictions." Tate nodded slowly. "I had to try to make it right." "You could have lost everything again." "I already had." Tate met his son's gaze. "My reputation, my position, your respect. What else was there to lose?" William's jaw tightened. "You know, all those years I wanted to believe there was more to you than just power and pride, that somewhere inside was the father who taught me about justice when I was a kid." The words hit Tate like a physical blow. He remembered those days, William sitting in his study, asking endless questions about the law, about right and wrong. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of those simple truths himself. "I'm trying to find my way back to being that person," Tate said quietly. William leaned forward slightly. "The governor's office called me this morning." Tate's heart stopped. Of course they'd contact William. He was one of the city's most respected attorneys now. "They wanted my opinion," William continued, "about whether you'd really changed." The air felt thick in Tate's lungs. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them about this." William gestured to the small office. "About how you've been working pro bono cases, helping people who can't afford legal representation. About how you've been living in a one-bedroom apartment instead of your mansion, using your savings to fund appeals for people you wrongly convicted." Tate swallowed hard. He hadn't known William was aware of any of that. "I told them," William said, his voice softening slightly, "that maybe my father was finally becoming the man he once taught me to be." Tears pricked at Tate's eyes. He blinked them back, not trusting himself to speak. "The pardon decision will be announced tomorrow," William said, standing up. "Whatever happens, I thought you should know that." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Dad?" "Yes?" "I'll be there when they make the announcement." Before Tate could respond, William was gone, leaving him alone with the humming fluorescent lights and the stack of cases waiting for his attention. He picked up the top file, trying to focus on the words through his blur of emotions. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For now, there was work to do. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees lining the street outside the Legal Aid Center. Tate stood on the sidewalk, briefcase in hand, watching people hurry past. A month had passed since the governor's office had approved the pardon request, and life had settled into a new rhythm, one that felt more genuine than anything he'd known before. A young mother pushing a stroller smiled at him as she passed. He nodded back, remembering how people used to avert their eyes when they saw him coming. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, and there was something freeing about that. The Legal Aid Center's worn brick facade looked different to him now. What he'd first seen as a symbol of his fall from grace had become a sanctuary of sorts. Inside those walls, he helped people who truly needed it, not those who could afford to buy justice. "Morning, Judge," called Marcus, one of the regular clients, as he approached the building. The young man had been wrongfully evicted, and Tate was helping him fight his case. "Good morning, Marcus. Ready for today's meeting?" "Yes, sir. Got all the paperwork you asked for right here." Marcus patted his backpack. Tate checked his watch. They had 10 minutes before the office officially opened. He used to measure time in billable hours and high-profile cases. Now he measured it in small victories and genuine thank yous. The security guard, Betty, unlocked the front door and waved them in. "Another busy day ahead, Mr. Tate?" "Aren't they all?" he replied with a warm smile. The fluorescent lights flickered to life as they entered, illuminating the waiting area where a handful of people already sat. Each face told a story of struggle, of systems that had failed them, of justice denied. These were the people he'd overlooked for so many years. As he led Marcus to his office, Tate caught his reflection in a window. His expensive suits had been replaced by more modest attire, and gray had crept further into his temples. But his eyes looked different, clearer, more present. The weight of pretense he'd carried for decades had lifted. His small office was cluttered with case files and legal reference books, most donated by other attorneys. A child's crayon drawing hung on the wall, a gift from a little girl whose mother he'd helped gain custody. "My hero," it read in wobbly letters. That simple picture meant more to him than any of the prestigious awards that used to line his chambers. "Let's see what you've got," Tate said, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat. As they reviewed the documentation, Tate felt that familiar surge of purpose. Each case, no matter how small it might seem to others, represented someone's whole world. He'd learned that the hard way. The morning sun streamed through his window, casting long shadows across his desk. Outside, the city bustled with activity, the same city where he'd once wielded power like a weapon. Now, he was using his knowledge to shield others from that same abuse of power. A knock at his door revealed Sarah, the center's coordinator. "Mr. Tate, your 10 o'clock is here early, and the Thompson family sent these." She placed a Tupperware container on his desk. "Mrs. Thompson's famous cookies. She says thank you for helping with their bankruptcy filing." The gesture touched him deeply. In his old life, clients had sent expensive gifts, watches, bottles of rare whiskey, concert tickets, but none had ever meant as much as these homemade cookies, offered from genuine gratitude rather than obligation. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be ready in 5 minutes." As he wrapped up with Marcus, Tate realized he no longer counted the hours until the day's end. Instead, he found himself wishing for more time to help more people. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd found true fulfillment only after losing everything he'd once thought important. The morning continued its steady pace, a stream of clients each carrying their own burdens, seeking help in a system that often seemed designed to defeat them. Tate had become their guide, their advocate, their defender, and in doing so, he'd finally become the kind of judge he should have been all along, one who truly served justice, not power. Tate sat at his desk surrounded by stacks of case files and legal documents. The office was barely bigger than a closet, nothing like his old chambers, but it felt right. Sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. He picked up a photo frame that Lily had brought during her visit a few days ago. It showed them together at her high school graduation, both smiling, both unaware of what the future would hold. Her words still echoed in his mind. "I'm proud of who you're becoming, Grandpa." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Maria, one of the center's paralegals, poked her head in. "Mr. Tate, your next client is here. The eviction case?" He nodded, straightening his tie. A simple cotton one now, not the silk ones he used to wear. "Send them in, please." A young couple entered, clutching papers and looking nervous. The woman held a sleeping baby against her shoulder. Tate gestured to the two mismatched chairs across from his desk. "Please, sit down," he said warmly. "I'm William Tate, and I'll be helping with your case." The husband spoke first, his voice tight with worry. "We've never needed a lawyer before. We don't have much money." "That's why we're here," Tate assured them. "The Legal Aid Center provides free services to those who need them most." The words felt natural now, not rehearsed like they had in the beginning. As they explained their situation, a landlord trying to force them out of their apartment with illegal tactics, Tate took careful notes. He remembered how he used to rush through cases, seeing people as problems to solve rather than lives to protect. "Your landlord is counting on you not knowing your rights," he explained, pulling out relevant housing statutes. "But that's exactly why we're here, to make sure everyone has access to justice, not just those who can afford it." The baby stirred and began to fuss. Without missing a beat, Tate reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small package of crackers he kept for situations like this. The mother's surprised smile reminded him of Lily, how she used to light up when he'd produce candy from his pocket during their visits. "The law is meant to protect everyone," he continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Not just the powerful. We're going to fight this together." As he outlined their legal options, Tate felt the familiar surge of purpose that had been growing stronger each day. This wasn't about power or prestige anymore. It was about using his knowledge to help people who truly needed it. The couple left his office an hour later, standing taller, hope replacing the fear in their eyes. Tate watched them go, then turned back to the mountain of paperwork on his desk. Each file represented someone counting on him, not to bend the law in their favor, but to make sure it protected them as it was meant to do. He picked up the next file, adjusting his reading glasses. The office was small, the pay was minimal, and the hours were long. But for the first time in his career, he felt like he was doing what he should have been doing all along. Maria appeared in the doorway again. "Your son William called while you were in with clients. He wants to know if you're still on for dinner tonight." Tate smiled, thinking of how his relationship with William had slowly begun to heal. "Yes," he said. "Tell him I wouldn't miss it." He turned back to his work, the afternoon sun warming his shoulders through the window. The simple wooden desk, the Community Legal Aid Center's logo on his business cards, the grateful faces of his clients. This was his world now, and somehow it felt more valuable than all the power he'd once held. The morning light streamed through the dusty windows of the Legal Aid Center as Tate straightened his tie. It wasn't the expensive silk he used to wear, but a simple cotton one that felt more appropriate for his new role. He glanced at the clock, 8:55 a.m. His appointment would arrive any minute. Right on time, a sharp knock echoed through the small office. Tate opened the door to find himself face to face with William Tate, his son. The younger man stood there in an impeccable suit, his posture rigid and professional. His face showed no warmth, just the cool detachment of a lawyer meeting with a colleague. "Thank you for coming," Tate said softly, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. William entered and sat down, placing his leather briefcase beside him. "Let's keep this professional. I'm here because my client's case overlaps with one of yours." Tate nodded, trying to hide how much his son's coldness stung. "Of course. The Martinez case?" "Yes." William pulled out a manila folder. "My client is willing to testify about the corruption in the housing authority, but he wants assurances." The irony wasn't lost on either of them, a former corrupt judge working with his estranged son on a case about corruption. Tate watched as William laid out documents with precise movements, noting how his son's hands were steady while his own trembled slightly. "Your client's testimony could help dozens of families," Tate said carefully, including Mrs. Martinez and her children. "I'm aware." William's voice remained neutral. "That's the only reason I agreed to this meeting." The tension in the room felt like a physical weight. Tate remembered teaching William how to ride a bike, helping him with homework, attending his law school graduation. Now his son wouldn't even look him in the eye. "The terms are straightforward," William continued, "all business. Full immunity in exchange for detailed testimony about the kickback scheme." Tate reviewed the documents, conscious of every movement. One wrong word could shatter this fragile professional courtesy. "These terms seem fair. I'll need to discuss them with Mrs. Martinez, but I believe she'll agree." "Good." William checked his watch. "I have another appointment. I'll need your answer by tomorrow morning." As William stood to leave, Tate couldn't help himself. "Will, I'm proud of the lawyer you've become. The man you've become." William paused at the door, his back stiff. "I learned what kind of lawyer to be by watching you, Dad. I learned exactly what not to do." The words hit Tate like physical blows, but he forced himself to remain steady. "You learned well then." William turned slightly, finally meeting his father's eyes. There was pain there, and anger, but also something else. Uncertainty. "Just don't mess this up. These families need help." "I won't," Tate promised. "You have my word." "Your word didn't used to mean much," William said quietly. "We'll see if that's changed." After William left, Tate sat heavily in his chair, the morning light now feeling harsh rather than warm. The meeting had gone as well as could be expected, but the professional courtesy had done nothing to bridge the vast emotional gulf between father and son. He picked up the Martinez file, forcing himself to focus on the work ahead. His son's trust, like everyone else's, would have to be earned one case at a time, one right decision at a time. There would be no shortcuts, no easy reconciliation. Looking at the photos of the Martinez family in their rundown apartment, Tate felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had to get this right, not just for them, but for every step toward redemption he hoped to take. Tate, once a powerful judge, now found himself defending Marcus Thompson, a young man wrongfully accused of theft. As Tate stood in the defense chair, the weight of his past decisions as a judge, often dismissing the defense, haunted him. This was different. He was now advocating for justice, not just enforcing the law. The courtroom felt foreign to him as he faced Judge Sarah Martinez, a former mentee, and his son William, now a prosecutor. As the trial progressed, Tate felt the responsibility of truly understanding the weight of justice. He became more focused on defending Marcus, realizing the importance of truth over expediency. After the trial, Tate spent long hours in his small office, doubting whether he'd done enough. His son William visited him and expressed admiration for Tate's honest defense in the courtroom, telling him he had seen the father he always wanted. Tate, reflecting on the many cases he'd once handled with little regard for truth, was grateful for his son's words. William suggested they grab coffee to talk about cases, a small but significant gesture that offered a glimpse of reconciliation. Tate, still uncertain about the trial's outcome, was left waiting for the verdict, hoping his newfound purpose had made a difference. The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Tate's cramped office at the Legal Aid Center. A far cry from his former chambers, the space was barely big enough for a desk and 2 chairs, with filing cabinets lining every available wall. But lately the small room had started to feel like home. Tate sat at his desk, reviewing the final paperwork for Marcus Thompson's case. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned each page, remembering the long hours and sleepless nights that had led to this moment. The verdict had come in yesterday. Not guilty. His first major victory as a defense attorney. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, straightening his posture out of old habit. Sarah, the center's receptionist, poked her head in. "There's someone here to see you, Mr. Tate. Says he's your son." Tate's heart skipped a beat. William. He hadn't seen his son since before the scandal broke. Their last conversation had been a heated phone call where William made it clear he wanted nothing to do with his father's disgrace. "Send him in," Tate managed, his mouth suddenly dry. William entered, looking every bit the successful attorney in his tailored suit. His expression was guarded, but there was something else there too. Curiosity, perhaps. "Hello, Father," William said stiffly, remaining by the door. "William." Tate gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." His son hesitated before taking the seat. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "I heard about the Thompson case," William finally said. "Good work." Tate nodded, studying his son's face. "Thank you. It means a lot coming from you." "I've been following your work here," William continued, his voice careful and measured. "The cases you've taken on, the people you've helped. It's different from what I expected." "Different from what I expected too," Tate admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. "But I'm learning. Every day, I'm learning." William's eyes swept around the modest office, taking in the overflowing filing cabinets and the worn furniture. "This is quite a change from your chambers at the courthouse." "It is," Tate managed a small smile. "But I'm finding that some changes, even difficult ones, can lead us where we need to be." His son's expression softened slightly. "The Thompson family, they couldn't afford a proper defense before you took the case." "No," Tate replied quietly. "They couldn't, just like so many others I sentenced without a second thought." He paused, the weight of his past decisions heavy on his shoulders. "I was wrong, William. About so many things." William leaned forward, his professional facade cracking just slightly. "I watched the trial footage. You fought for him like you actually cared." "I did care. I do care." Tate met his son's gaze. That's something else I'm learning to do. A moment passed between them, fragile but hopeful. William reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file. I actually came because I have a case I'd like your opinion on. Pro bono work, a family facing eviction. I thought, maybe we could work on it together. Tate's hands trembled as he accepted the file, recognizing this for what it was. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a chance, a beginning. I'd like that, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'd like that very much. The morning sun continued to stream through the blinds, casting warm light across the scattered papers and worn furniture. In this small office, surrounded by the work of redemption, father and son began to bridge the gulf between them, one careful word at a time. The morning light crept through the dusty blinds of Tate's small office at the Legal Aid Center. He sat at his desk, surrounded by towering stacks of case files, each one representing someone who needed help. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed, too absorbed in reviewing his notes from Darius's case. The image of Darius in the courtroom yesterday kept replaying in his mind. The young man's hands had trembled as he stood before the judge, his eyes full of fear and hope. Tate had fought hard, harder than he'd ever fought in his old life as a judge, but the outcome still hung in the balance. Running his fingers through his graying hair, Tate picked up another file. His shoulders ached from hunching over paperwork all night. The office felt smaller than usual today, the walls seeming to close in with each passing hour. A gentle tap on his door made him look up. Sarah, the center's receptionist, stepped inside with a fresh cup of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said, placing it on his desk. "You've been here since dawn." "Thanks, Sarah." Tate managed a tired smile. "Just can't seem to let this one go." Sarah's kind eyes studied him for a moment. "You did everything you could for Darius. You know that, right?" Tate leaned back in his chair, the old springs creaking beneath him. "Did I, though? Maybe if I'd pushed harder on the witness testimony, or if I'd—" "Stop that," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "You're not that man anymore, the one who thinks he can control everything. Sometimes we just have to wait and trust the process." Her words hit home, making Tate pause. She was right. He wasn't that man anymore. The old Judge Tate would have seen Darius as just another case number, another faceless defendant to be processed through the system. Now he saw the person behind the paperwork, the story behind the charges. Looking around his cramped office, Tate took in the water stain on the ceiling, the rickety filing cabinet with the stuck bottom drawer, the worn carpet beneath his feet. It was nothing like his old chambers, with their polished mahogany and leather chairs. Yet somehow this space felt more real, more honest. "I keep thinking about what I would have done sitting up there on the bench," Tate admitted quietly. "How quickly I would have dismissed Darius's side of the story. How easily I would have accepted the prosecution's version of events." Sarah pulled up the client chair, its legs scraping against the floor. "But that's not who you are now. I've seen how hard you work for these people, how much you care. That counts for something." Tate picked up Darius's file again, thumbing through the pages he'd practically memorized. The young man's story was there in black and white. Wrong place, wrong time, a series of unfortunate circumstances that could have happened to anyone. But now Tate understood that justice wasn't just about the law. It was about seeing the humanity in every case. The morning sun grew stronger, casting long shadows across his desk. Outside his door, he could hear the center coming to life, phones ringing, voices discussing cases, the copy machine humming. Each sound represented another person seeking justice, another story waiting to be heard. His new office might be small and cluttered, but it was where he needed to be. The tension in his shoulders remained, the weight of Darius's case still heavy on his mind. But for the first time since yesterday's hearing, Tate felt something else too, a quiet determination to keep fighting no matter what the outcome might be. Tate, once a respected judge, now found himself on the defense side of a courtroom, facing his son, William, who worked as a prosecutor. Tate's client, Marcus Thompson, was wrongly accused of a crime, and Tate was determined to fight for justice, challenging the legal system he'd once been a part of. As the trial unfolded, Tate's past prejudices and mistakes became painfully clear, but he was resolved to make things right, especially for his son. William, who had adopted the same tactics Tate had once used, began to question his own certainty as the case progressed. Tate's closing arguments were an emotional plea for justice and redemption. He confessed his past errors, urging the jury to look beyond their initial judgments and to see the truth. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of understanding in William's eyes, marking a potential shift in their relationship. The trial's outcome would not only determine Marcus's fate, but also signify the extent of Tate's personal redemption. A few months later, Tate found himself working at a legal aid center, far from his former life as a judge. Now he focused on helping the underprivileged, offering his expertise to those in need, including a woman facing eviction. This humble work, guiding people through their struggles, gave Tate a sense of purpose that his past career never could. As he helped others, Tate found peace, knowing he was finally doing real justice. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.